Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Many of us like to take a walk in our favorite national park, whether it's a short stroll down one of the boardwalks at Yellowstone National Park, the hike to the top of Old Rag in Shenandoah National Park, or up the Mist Trail in Yosemite National Park. We like to get out and experience parks up close. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. As you might imagine, there are walks in the national park system, and then there are walks. Kevin Fedarko and his photographic sidekick, Pete McBride, took one of those other hikes in Grand Canyon National Park, and it didn't initially go as planned. While Fedarko raised some serious blisters on his feet that required duct tape to protect, McBride almost needed a medical evacuation from the backcountry. Still, the hike, or rather hikes, generated a compelling book from Fedarko titled, appropriately enough, A Walk in the Park. We'll be back in a minute with Kevin to explore what went wrong and what went right on their hike.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Kevin.
Thanks, Kurt. It's great to be here.
Now, before we get into your walk, let's talk a little bit about your introduction to Grand Canyon National Park. You basically walked into a river runner's office and asked if you could join the crew, and as an unpaid crew member, is that correct?
It is. This is a story that goes back almost a quarter of a century. It was in the spring of 2003, I believe. I drove through a early spring snowstorm from my home at the time in Santa Fe, New Mexico, all night across I-40 over the Continental Divide. My first trip to Flagstaff, Arizona, walked through the door of a Grand Canyon River outfitter and found myself in the presence of a little fleet of wooden boats, Grand Canyon whitewater dories that seduced me. They grabbed me by the lapels. There was something about their shape and their colors and the beauty and the simplicity of their lines that drew me to them and to the place for which they had been designed to move, which is the riparian paradise at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And I kind of resolved in that moment that even though it was almost categorically impossible to make less money than I was at the time as a failing freelance magazine writer, I was going to have to find a way to allow those boats to be kind of ambassadors and emissaries and draw me into and introduce me to the world of the Grand Canyon, a place that I had dreamt about as a boy growing up in Pittsburgh in the southwestern part of Pennsylvania, but had never laid eyes on up to that point in my life. And I was in my mid-30s by then. So that was kind of a seminal moment for me. It was a crossroads. It was a point that demarcated a fundamental shift in the direction, the path that my life had taken up to that point, and everything that flowed from that moment was fundamentally different by virtue of having been drawn to this landscape and to develop a connection with it that would eventually, I want to say mature into an obsession, but maybe devolve into an obsession is the better verb to use.
Perhaps. Now, not only being new to Grand Canyon, you were new to river running. Is that correct? I mean, you had never run an oar boat before?
Absolutely not. I had been on a boat a couple of times in my life. I had no experience with whitewater. I had no ability to read rivers or row whitewater. And as you are probably well aware, as most of your listeners may well be acutely aware, people who move into a career as a guide on the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon is usually the point to which you work yourself after having invested years, maybe even a couple of decades, on smaller rivers. The Grand Canyon is the place that you kind of graduate to when it's time for you to climb the final rungs of the ladder and emerge at the top of the the river hierarchy. It's not a particularly good place to kind of begin, just because it's an isolated world. It's relatively big water. And although the rapids in the Grand Canyon are relatively simple and for the most part are single move rapids with a couple of exceptions, the consequences can be significant. The consequences of a mistake, a moment of inattention, a wrong move. You can find yourself on the wrong side of an upside down or boat or motor rig, swimming for your life and then trying to explain to your trip leader why you have allowed the river to tear your raft apart like a wildebeest being torn apart by a pack of hyenas, and how you're going to replace all of the gear and the food and the equipment and the client's clothing that you've lost and has now disappeared into the river. So, not a great place to begin, but that's where I began.
No, it's almost like, I want to be a climber, so I think my first climb is going to be Denali or maybe Mount Everest.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
It must have been an incredible introduction, though, to the river corridor through Grand Canyon National Park. I mean, I've hiked down to the river. I haven't yet floated the river, but it's a totally different world. And as you said, you're in the riparian zone. There's a lot of serenity down there, aside from the raft chewing up rapids.
There is. I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of that place. Once you move through the gateway to the Grand Canyon at Lee's Ferry, which is where all river trips through the canyon begin, you are entering a world that is framed and defined by these mile high ramparts of rock that claw their way more than a vertical mile into the sky from either side of the river. And you spend the first couple of days watching a succession of ever older layers of rock emerge from the river and rise toward the sky. Within 2.5 days, you're inside of, what feels to some people like a rocky prison in a way, from which there's no escape but to keep moving downriver ever further west until you reach the Grand Wash Cliffs. And so, your every moment of your time down inside of that place is defined by the texture of the rock, the profile of the cliffs and ledges that loom over you, the pageantry of light that plays against the surface of the rock from the moment the sun comes up in the morning to the moment it disappears over the rim rock to the west, and by the river itself, this thing that, as you touched on just a moment ago, this thing that not only itself feels alive and imbued with dynamism and energy, but it is the thing, at least to the eyes of a man or a woman who's rowing a boat through the Grand Canyon, it's the thing that imbues the canyon itself with life. It creates this riparian corridor where the density of plants and animals is up to 500 times greater than what you're going to find 100 yards above the water line, from there to the rim. It's green and vibrant and lush. It stands in incredibly sharp and invigorating contrast to the brutally arid world, the desert that stretches around it and above it. And you spend enough time on that river in a boat, and you begin to believe that everything down there, the cliffs, the ledges, the sky, the rock, the light. It's just backdrop for what is the most important and elemental and central thing inside the canyon itself, which is the river. And the fact that the river is the instrument, the original tool that carved and sculpted and polished and honed the canyon in the first place just seems to underscore that truth. And everything else is subordinate to the river. And so that is that's almost a kind of like a religious article of faith that I came to adopt. Because if you're a young boatman in the canyon, your view of what you're seeing and what you're experiencing is deeply influenced by the people you're surrounded by and trying your best to learn from. And the way they see the canyon is often how you see the canyon. And so I came away from that experience worshiping at the altar of the Colorado River and convinced that it was the most important part of that world, and that anything else down there was secondary to the river.
Now, you mentioned it is the life zone of Grand Canyon National Park because of the riparian area. One of the interesting sections that you recounted from your rafting days was when you came upon some pelicans, a small flock of pelicans that kept flying upstream and then drifting down through one of the rapids and getting up and coming back upstream. One of my recent interviews was with a wildlife biologist who talked about animals playing, and it certainly sounds that that's what the pelicans were doing.
I think so. I mean, this was such a beautiful morning. We had a layover day, which of course are the some of the most special days in the canyon when you spend not one but two nights and an entire day anchored at one spot. And this is a place, a very famous place in the canyon, right around the middle of a river trip, which is important because it means that enough time has elapsed since you launched at Lee's Ferry that you've begun to leave behind the trappings and the connections that bind you to the what we call the world above the rims. You know, you've taken off your wristwatch and you've tucked it in your ammo can because minutes and hours aren't important any longer. What calibrates your day is, you know, when the sun comes up and when the sun goes down. And you've stopped worrying about hygiene a little bit, except for maybe taking a bath in some muddy river water at the end of the day. And you've started to sort of tune into the natural world. But it's also a point that, you know, Stone Creek and the rapid just above it, Dubendorf, by virtue of being at the center of a river trip, it's also at a point where the end of the trip is far enough away that you haven't begun thinking about the takeout or getting back to the highway or what the weather's going to be like and whether your flight home is going to be on time or not. You are just immersed in the world of the canyon. And so we were at this beach, and layover days are wonderful because the clients get to do whatever they want. A lot of them go off on hikes. Some of them just find a spot and tuck in with a book. Others will just nap all day long. But a group of us guides, we were standing around making a plan for the day, and we noticed this flock of pelicans, as you said a moment ago, and they kept flying up to the top of the rapid, Dubendorf, and they flew in echelon, and they landed in echelon, and then they ran the rapids in a V-shaped formation. And the first time they did it, we kind of just admired them. You know, they took a really great line through the rapid, and we watched them surf through the haystacks and circle out at the end of the tail waves and eddy up on the far side of the river. And then they flew back and they did the whole thing again. And we realized it wasn't just a one-off. So we kind of settled in to watch the show, and we spent the next several hours watching these pelicans run Dubendorf and debating why they were doing it. There was a theory that maybe they had insects in their feathers, and this was a way to kind of clean themselves. Or maybe they were pelicans, so they really belong in the ocean. At least we thought they did. And maybe they were recalibrating their compass by, you know, running this rapid over and over again so they could figure out how to get back to the Sea of Cortez or the Pacific Ocean. But eventually, we all agreed that the only explanation that made sense was that they had been struck by the same condition that governed all of us. They were absolutely besotted with and seduced by and transfixed with the glory and the beauty and the wonder and the fun of running whitewater. And they just couldn't get enough of it. And that's why they were doing it. And that's what bound them to us and united all of us in our kind of celebration of the river and the place itself. And
Yeah.
it was just a lovely moment that I think I'll remember. I hope I'll remember forever until the end of my life.
Yeah, it sounds like an incredible moment. And for listeners who are not aware, there are several ways you can take a Grand Canyon river trip. A motorized trip, you can get down the canyon in a week, or you can be more relaxing and take a paddle boat, an oar boat, where your trip could be 2 weeks or 3 weeks long. And as you were saying, Kevin, when you get down into the river 2 or 3 days down from Lee's Ferry, you find yourself living on river time, and you're really in unison with the sun and what's going on and the river and everything around you. Now, regarding the hikes that you and Pete took in the Grand Canyon, long before you guys had the idea to do that, two others had that idea, right? Colin Fletcher and Ken Grua.
Yes, these are two guys who kind of adopted a very different approach from what I just described. I was talking at great length, I'm afraid, a moment ago about, how you can come to see the world of the canyon through the lens of the Colorado River and convince yourself that it's the most important element in the whole equation. And what I'm about to say in no way negates the truth of all of that. It just simply adds another dimension to that truth, which is that, well, people who are obsessed with boating and whitewater in the Grand Canyon are busy celebrating the fact that it's the center of the world and the source of vitality and life at the bottom of the canyon. They're ignoring the rather inconvenient truth that the Colorado River, this 100-yard wide ribbon of water running along the bottom of the canyon, is less than 1% of the entire 2 million acre terrain that comprises Grand Canyon National Park. The rest of it is these cliffs and ledges that I was talking about a moment ago. It's not the world of the water, it's the world of the rock. And it's the rock that dominates the landscape, that defines the landscape, that comprises the majority of the real estate that's out there. And you can make a pretty compelling argument that if the only thing that you know about or are acquainted with in Grand Canyon is the Colorado River and the beaches next to it, you're ignorant of most of the rest of the canyon. You don't know very much about it. And I think it was, in part, it was that fact that drew both of the men that you talked about a moment ago. Colin Fletcher, the great voice of the American backpacking backpacking movement in the 1960s and 70s, a man who was born in Wales and lived and had enough adventure for several lifetimes by the time he got to the United States, who undertook an epic journey in the summer of 1963, hiking across what was at the time Grand Canyon National Park. The important distinction being that at that time, Grand Canyon National Park comprised only about a third of the canyon itself. But Fletcher wrote about that journey, that solo backpacking trip that he took, and put it all into the pages of a book called The Man Who Walked Through Time, which became an international bestseller, which helped to spur and trigger, um, you know, at first thousands and then tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people to begin walking through wilderness, not just in Grand Canyon, but all over the country, and celebrating landscape and experiencing solitude and wonder and natural beauty. And when I was growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a place that was in many ways defined by industry, by mining and steel, a place where by the time I was born in 1963, every aspect of the landscape itself, the land, the soil, the water, even the air had been tainted and poisoned by the steel industry and by mining. But my father, when I was around 10 or 11 years old, handed me a copy, a paperback copy of Fletcher's book. And it was the image of Fletcher on the cover of that book, a photo he took of himself standing on a ledge, looking down into this oceanic expanse of bare naked rock with this thin blue ribbon of water running along the bottom that opened my mind to the rather electric possibility that there were places out there beyond Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where you could allow your eye to travel to the furthest horizon and the view would not be marred by a single smokestack or blast furnace or train loaded with coal. And the seed that that image planted in my mind, would take many years to achieve fruition, but it was what eventually drew me to the canyon. And when I arrived, I spent 6 summers down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon attempting and failing to become a dory guide, failing because I was so bad at rowing and reading whitewater. But I ended up sitting around the campfires, listening to river guides tell stories. I ended up writing a book about the biggest story that I heard, the biggest story of them all, a story about a legendary runoff that took place in the summer of 1983 and a crew of 3 dory guides who set a speed record through the canyon by using that flood as a slingshot to propel them through the canyon. And the man who was kind of the head of that venture, Kenton Grua, a dory guide, the great distinction that he has, the thing that makes him famous beyond the confines of Grand Canyon National Park, is having set the speed record for the fastest boat run ever through the Grand Canyon. But what many people do not realize is that his greater achievement was something that happened several years earlier when he read Colin Fletcher's book, was kind of offended by the idea that Fletcher had only hiked a third of the canyon and decided that somebody needed to do the whole thing, and probably the best person to do that was him. And so Kenton Grua, in the spring of 1977, I believe, became the first person in modern recorded history. That's an important distinction to make. The first person in modern recorded history, the first non-native, non-indigenous person that we're aware of to find his way on foot along the entire length of the Grand Canyon. A journey that I should mention, for which there's no trail. To move from Lee's Ferry to the Grand Wash Cliffs or in the reverse direction is a significant act of, among many other things, physical stamina and mental strength and determination. It's a significant act of land navigation. It's piecing together a series of ledges, oftentimes very thin ledges, and moving in and out of what feel like endless tributary canyons. And to give you an idea of what an achievement it is, the Colorado River, as it moves from Lee's Ferry to the Grand Wash Cliffs, it covers about 277 miles. But if you're on foot, if you're moving up and down the walls of the canyon like Kenton Grua was in 1977, if you're moving in and out of those, a portion of those 600 odd tributary canyons, some of which can take hours or even days to move into and back out of, you're going to cover somewhere between 600 and 750 miles. It's a landscape that seems like it was almost designed to resist the idea of human beings moving through it on foot with ease. It's a landscape through which the only highway that makes any sense is the river. And so to move on foot through a place like Grand Canyon is an irrational act, but it's also an act of beauty, I think, because it takes you into this world that almost no one experiences. Large portions of it are invisible from the rims or from the river. The vast majority of the 6 million people that visit the park each year, they never see the secrets and the wonders and the treasures that are tucked, inside those walls. And the only way to really experience them to see them, to be touched by them, and to touch them is to strap everything that you need on your back and move through it on foot. And so Kenton Grua and Colin Fletcher were two seminal figures who kind of bookend the business of moving through the Grand Canyon on foot. And anybody who sets out to undertake something like that encounters these two men and their stories.
This is Kurt Repenchek with the National Parks Traveler. We're talking today with Kevin Fedarko, an author whose latest book is called A Walk in the Park. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit news organization dedicated to providing essential coverage for our national parks and protected areas. Our year-end fundraising campaign and donations from supporters like you help make this coverage possible every day of the year. We'll open 2025 with our 4th annual Threatened and Endangered Parks package of stories, a sobering look at the state of the national park system and the challenges the National Park Service faces in working to conserve the scenery, the natural and historic objects, and the wildlife therein. We'll be looking at mining threats to the parks, the ever-soaring cost of trying to stay at a park lodge, the increasingly normal stormy weather that parks are enduring, the harsh impacts the Appalachian National Scenic Trail is absorbing from storms, invasive species, and forest fragmentation, as well as the changing political landscape and how it could impact both parks and the Park Service. We're in the final days of our News Match campaign. Please consider supporting our coverage of these essential places with a donation before year's end. It really does make a difference.
So, Kevin, was it the exploits of those two men that prompted you to consider a hike away from the river, or was it your river running days when you would spend time looking at the surrounding cliffs and canyons and tributaries and thought that'd be really cool to walk through that?
Well, to be honest, it was both of those things plus one other element. I mean, it's true that I did spend time lying on my boat, particularly at night, gazing up at those walls and, wondering what it might be like to move through that world on foot. I did spend time reading about Grua and Fletcher and trying to imagine what it might be like to follow in their footsteps and be drawn into this place that they had explored. But to be honest, I was such an inexperienced outdoors person. I was such a bad boatman that I had a pretty realistic sense that, moving into those cliffs and ledges on foot was far beyond my skill set and my abilities. And I never really considered doing it seriously until the idea was suggested to me by someone with whom I have a deeply dysfunctional relationship, Pete McBride, the National Geographic photographer and filmmaker. During those years, between 2003 and 2014, when I wasn't busy failing to become a dory guide during the summers in the Grand Canyon, I was out doing magazine stories, trying to pay the rent and the grocery bills, working on assignments, many of them with Pete. And we did a whole series of assignments that took us all over the world. And most of those assignments did not work out well. They turned into disasters, largely because, the truth of the matter is that Pete and I are both pretty bad when it comes to, preparation and homework and discipline. I like to blame Pete entirely for those things, but the fact is that we both contribute to those. And so, but Pete has an ability to seduce. He's very charismatic and energetic and fun person to be around. And he has an ability to talk people into doing things that they know they shouldn't be doing. And so it was I think it was the summer of 2014, Pete came to me with a tremendously bad idea and suggested that the two of us needed to undertake as an assignment for National Geographic a through hike of the Grand Canyon, despite having no preparation or skills that might enable us to do that successfully. But he also said that National Geographic was interested in funding a project wherein in which two, a writer and a photographer would move into this world that I've been talking about, this part of the most iconic, the most famous national park in America, a place that's recognized by almost every citizen of this country, but whose deepest secrets and treasures are known to almost no one. And the story that National Geographic was interested in was having a team, a photographer and a writer, move through that landscape on foot, write about the wonders and the treasures, but also the threats that loom over the landscape, and weave all of that into a story that would come out as part of the celebration of the centenary of the National Park Service, which would be celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2016. And the idea was so compelling, and Pete presented it in such a attractive manner that even though I had the distinct feeling that this was a terrible idea, at least for the two of us, I signed on. And that's how we ended up getting ourselves into the trouble that we got into.
I have to ask, what were you thinking? I mean, one of the people you came in contact with throughout this exploit, Dr. Tom Myers, described Grand Canyon as you put it, the biggest heat laboratory on the planet. As you mentioned earlier, there are few established trails to lead you throughout the Grand Canyon. Did you pause on your first attempt when you joined Rich Rudeau and his team and saw how prepared they were and how small their packs were and what gear they were carrying compared to what you and Pete were trying to carry? It must have taken your breath away and thought about going back to the car and driving back to Flagstaff.
No, absolutely. I mean, so you're talking about a moment that occurred very early on in our trip. After I signed on and agreed to do this, Pete set about trying to kind of get us geared up and planned for this venture. And he heard about a very, very experienced team of long distance backpackers, 4 men who were going to be undertaking a continuous through hike of the canyon. And maybe this is the moment where I should mention very briefly, if you're through hiking Grand Canyon, there's 2 ways to do it. You can start and not come out of the canyon until you get to the end. So you basically are doing it without stopping. And that is by far the hardest way to do it, a continuous through hike. But it is possible to break the through hike up into segments and stitch those segments together like you would stitch together beads on a necklace and assemble a through hike out of a series of 4 or 5 or 16 or 30 smaller hikes. And so Pete and I opted for a sectional hike, but we heard about this team that was going to do a continuous hike. And Pete called up the leader of that team, a man named Rich Rudeau, who's one of the most experienced backcountry travelers in Grand Canyon, who is a pioneer of slot canyons, these very, very deep, incredibly narrow, astonishingly dangerous, and largely until Rich got into the business of exploring them, largely untouched tributaries inside of Grand Canyon. And Pete reached out to Rich, and he practiced the same dark art on Rich that he practiced on me. He somehow convinced Rich to say yes to something he should have said no to. The idea that he and the rest of his team would permit these 2 nincompoops from National Geographic to accompany them on the first section of their through hike. It was supposed to be a roughly 67 river miles from Lee's Ferry to the confluence of the Little Colorado River. It was probably going to take about 18 to 20 days to do it. And Pete told me, when Pete delivered the news to me that Rich had allowed us to accompany him on this section. Pete said this was going to be fabulous because everything that he and I didn't know would be taught to us by Rich and his team in the canyon. And we would emerge from this first segment as kind of tanned, Adonis-like veteran through hikers without even having to go through the business of spending years, doing smaller hikes and learning the skills, the rappelling and the climbing and the pack rafting and the land navigation and the just the gear familiarization that's necessary to move efficiently and safely and wisely through this vertical wilderness inside of Grand Canyon. And so Pete and I showed up at the very first camp, overlooking Badger Rapid on the north rim of the Grand Canyon the night before that we were supposed to set off from Lee's Ferry with Rich and his team. And I'm embarrassed and ashamed to say this, but I'm a nonfiction writer. There's no way to get around this fact. We arrived with boxes from Patagonia and REI and a whole bunch of other outdoor stores, most of which had never even been opened or tested. We set about trying to unpack all of this gear in the dark and cram it all into our packs. And that is a kind of metaphoric representation of how naive and arrogant and ill-prepared we were for what was really a very, very serious endeavor that demanded a level of respect and preparation and seriousness that we had decided we didn't need to bring to the table. And that set the stage for, just an epic failure on our parts. Again, I'm ashamed to admit this, but this is also true. We made it through, Kurt, less than half the distance of our first segment. It took the canyon 5.5 days to break Pete and I in half, to reduce us, to drive us into the ground physically, and to reveal to us what was obvious to Rich Rudo and his crew pretty much from the moment we left Lee's Ferry, which is that we had no business trying to move through this environment on foot. And at the end of that 5.5 days, we admitted to Rich and his team that we couldn't keep up with them. We clawed our way out of the canyon. We drove back to Flagstaff, bickering with one another over which one of us was going to call up our editors at National Geographic headquarters in Washington, D.C., and explain that if they wanted the project completed, they were going to have to subcontract this thing out to like a couple of kaibab squirrels or creatures that could actually move through this environment. And we gave up. That's how hard we failed. That's how badly we failed. And that's how appropriate our failure was.
But at the same time, Rich Rudo must have been an incredible, thoughtful, and considerate gentleman who wanted to see you guys accomplish your task. And so while you were on your way back to Flagstaff with Pete, he got on his satellite phone and contacted some pros, so to speak, in Flagstaff who took you guys under their wings and taught you how to be long-distance hikers and what it took to get through the canyon. And so your second attempt at the through hike was much more surgical. And you guys really prepared differently for it, didn't you?
We did, and I should emphasize here that, what happened did not magically transform us into veteran through hikers. We were put through a crash course over the course of the next 6 weeks that really amounted to a kind of like hiking makeover, and this group of very serious long distance backpackers and boatmen and boatwomen in Flagstaff who cared passionately about the canyon, who had been contacted by Rich. They reached out to us and they told us that they wanted to help us, and they wanted to help us not just because they're kind and decent, generous people, and those are all qualities that you find within the subculture of the Grand Canyon. But they also wanted to help us. The main reason they wanted to help us is because they wanted to see this story about the canyon, and particularly about the threats looming over the canyon. They wanted to see that story written in the pages of National Geographic. They wanted some of these threats and vulnerabilities of this national park to be exposed, and so that people could take that into account as they think about this landscape. And when they had completed our kind of crash course, they then announced that they had appointed from among themselves babysitters and minders who were going to be going back into the canyon with us to help us move through it on foot, because despite all this preparation, we still lacked so much. I mean, this is such an extreme, demanding, brutal environment that you can only consider yourself fully prepared for it if you have invested not weeks or months, but years doing smaller ventures. That's the only way that you can really acquire the knowledge, the skills, the instincts that you need to move into this space. But the fact that these people reached out to us and invested so much in us and then went back into the canyon with us amounted to a kind of a miracle. And all of it was because of Rich. And it's important to note as well that as we resumed the business of moving through the canyon late that fall and across the winter and deep into the following spring, Rich, having completed his through hike in about 73 days, came out of the canyon and then looped back and joined us to see us through the two most difficult sections of the entire canyon: a circumnavigation of the Great Thumb Mesa in the middle of the winter, and a traverse of the incredibly dry, incredibly arid, and dangerous reaches of Western Grand Canyon the following spring, and then the autumn after that. And what I took from that, and I think what I just need to spend a word honoring here, is that, I mentioned a moment ago that the story that first inspired me to think about and want to move into the landscape of the Grand Canyon was Colin Fletcher. It's this account of Fletcher moving alone, solo, with a backpack through the wilderness. And if you spend any time, reading the canon of literature of American wilderness, you can quite quickly get to a point where you can convince yourself that it's important to experience natural beauty alone. You can't read Thoreau or John Muir or Edward Abbey without drawing a conclusion that there is something important about the solo experience of natural beauty, and the doorway and the window that it opens to revelations about oneself and one's character and one's strengths and weaknesses, without becoming convinced that, like, this is a central attribute of experiencing wilderness. In much the same way that if you're a boatman in the Grand Canyon, you come away convinced that the river is the central attribute of Grand Canyon National Park. And what this journey taught me was that that's not necessarily true. I do think there are things to be learned. There are incredibly important experiences that one can have alone. But for me, this was a communal experience. That what I learned from it is that it would have been impossible for myself or for Pete and I to move through this space alone, that we could only make our way through it in the company of others, with the help of others. And what I discovered, I didn't necessarily discover it, but I came to appreciate this at a far deeper level than I had prior to this journey, was that in addition to all of the other things that public lands, national parks, national monuments, national forests can give us, an exposure to natural beauty, a sense of wonder and awe, an ability to, as you said, move into and connect with, river time or desert time or forest time. The other thing that it can do is it can take, if you're moving through and experiencing it with other people that you care about, it can often take the bonds that connect you to those people and strengthen them and deepen them and enrich them in ways that you may not have anticipated. And that one of the greatest values that these landscapes have is their ability to connect us more tightly to people we care about and love. And I think that aspect of landscape and natural beauty has been largely ignored and sidestepped by the great writers, the classic writers like Muir and Abbey and Thoreau that we typically invoke. Aldo Leopold too, when we consider what nature has to offer us. And so I know I'm being really long-winded here, but I feel it's important that this is one of the things that this journey taught me, that there are many reasons that we can value these landscapes. There are many reasons why we need to protect them. There are many reasons why we need to fight on their behalf so that we can pass them along intact to future generations of Americans, to our children and our children's children. And one of those is that, in addition to whatever epiphanies they may discover or experience if they go into those places alone, there is this magic that can happen in the space between people who go into these places together. And that's one of the greatest things that this journey taught me.
I would certainly agree with you on that point. I think it also shows, if you're going solo, how insignificant we are in the bigger picture when you're surrounded by nature and what you see out there. Now, the hike gave you a better appreciation not only for your friends and your comrades, but for both the geology and the anthropology of the canyon. Isn't that true? I mean, you write that you and Pete and most visitors to Grand Canyon National Park have little appreciation that the rugged and pristine appearing landscape, quote, was once part of a complex mosaic of native desert cultures, each an entity unto itself, whose connections to the land ran far deeper than many modern Americans can even begin to imagine. I mean, you stand on the North Rim or you stand on the South Rim and you look down and you see a barren landscape. But you go down into that landscape and you discover how vibrant it is, no?
Absolutely. You discover how vibrant it is in terms of the flora and the fauna. You discover that, the canyon it looks like a lifeless expanse of bare rock, but you go down into it and you discover that it is a living biological laboratory, and the range of plants and animals, they correspond to a range of ecosystems that extends from what you would find in the subalpine tundra of central Canada, all the way down to the Mojave and Sonoran ecosystems in northern Mexico. It takes that entire spectrum of life, 2,000 linear miles, flips it from the horizontal to the vertical, and compresses it into a single mile. That's what it does in terms of the flora and the fauna. But the more time you spend inside of Grand Canyon, the more you begin to realize that it's not just about the vibrancy, it's not just about the plants and the animals. Everywhere you go, as your eye becomes trained, you begin to see evidence that in addition to plants and animals, this place is a home, has been a home for a very long time for people, for human beings. You see the potsherds, the fragments of the pottery that they shaped from the earth itself. You see the tools that they used, the arrowheads and the spear points to survive inside of the canyon. You see the niches that we call granaries in the walls of the canyon, where they stored seeds and food to protect them from the elements and from the animals. And at very special places in the canyon, places that aren't necessarily demarcated on maps, you see something truly extraordinary, which is you see where these people, the people who are part of this environment and part of this landscape, long before anybody who looks or sounds like me as the descendant of white European settlers, long before any of these people came to the shores of this continent, you see art that was created by the archaic people and the ancestral Puebloan people who lived in this landscape thousands of years prior to the arrival of Europeans. Art in the form of petroglyphs and polychrome pictographs. And these images on the walls of the canyon they're incredibly beautiful, but they're also incredibly mysterious. They're these, just to our eye, bizarre forms in which birds and animals and plants and human beings seem to kind of merge together. And it's impossible to really discern what the meaning is behind these images, what these people who affixed this art to the walls of the canyon were attempting to communicate to themselves or to others. It's filled with mystery, but it also wields enormous power because when you stand in the presence of art like that, you can find yourself snapped like a rubber band thousands of years back into the past. 4,000 years, 6,000 years, maybe 9,000 years, right up to the back end of the Pleistocene. And you are connected to and standing in the presence of the spirit of people who were some of the original human inhabitants of this landscape. People who are also connected to what we think of as the modern tribes of Grand Canyon, the tribes that were directly encountered by the first Europeans to move into this landscape. And there's not just one of them, right? I mean, there's like, in the eastern part of the canyon, there's the Hopi and the Zuni and the Navajo. And then arcing across the entire North Rim, there's 5 separate bands of Southern Paiute. And then, like, if you come down onto the southern side of the river on the far western part of the canyon, you meet with the Wallapai tribe, and then you continue east along the South Rim, and you will find evidence of seasonal migrations of the Yavapai Apache coming up from the south. And then directly in the center of it all, there's the tribe that all of the others referred to as the guardians of the Grand Canyon, referred to them then and still referred to them now. And those are, of course, the Havasupai. And these are people who were part of the past in this landscape. These are people who connected with and understood aspects of this landscape at a level that's almost impossible for somebody like me or you, Kurt, to imagine. And much of this knowledge that they carried and acquired was encoded in their language, in their traditions, and their ethos as a people, all of which means that what happened in this thing that Pete and I were supposed to be celebrating, when the National Park Service was created in 1916, and then 3 years later in 1919 when Grand Canyon National Park was created, all of which makes what happened kind of a crime because the part of the national park story that we don't like to talk about very much. We love to celebrate our parks. We love to celebrate the fact that we have demonstrated the sagacity and the wisdom as a society to identify some of our most beautiful landscapes and set them aside and protect them for future generations. But we don't like to talk very much about the fact that when we did all of that, there were people living in these places, not just Grand Canyon, but in all of our parks, in Yellowstone and Yosemite and Acadia and the Everglades and Wrangell St. Elias. And when we created these parks, we kicked these people out of their homes. We evicted them from the places that they knew better than us. And then we wrote them out of the stories that we tell ourselves about what these places are. And so another aspect of this journey that was incredibly important for me and for Pete was to encounter these people, because the remarkable thing is that they're not just part of the past, they're still there. All of those tribes that I mentioned, those 11 tribes, there are reservations on the periphery of Grand Canyon National Park. Those people still live there. They still go into the canyon. They come into the canyon to perform rituals and ceremonies, to mourn their dead, to perform acts of protest against things like uranium mining or industrialized forms of tourism that they feel are a violation of the standards of stewardship that they feel should govern our relationship to the land itself. They're still part of the place. They're part of the present. And by virtue of their proximity and by virtue of the sovereignty that they enjoy as Native American tribes, they're an incredibly important part of the future. And so this is a part of the story of this place and this landscape that I did not know about. In addition to all the other failures of preparation, like failures of like acquiring the right gear and learning about land navigation and getting physically fit. I also failed to just take the time and the energy to invest in reading about and learning about and connecting with the tribes of the canyon, the tribes of the national park. That's what I should say. They're the tribes of this national park. And to the great credit of the National Park Service, Grand Canyon National Park among them, the Park Service is making an effort now to acknowledge and atone for some of these sins that have been committed in the past, to recognize and in some ways re-enfranchise these tribes, to bring them back into the story, to treat them with a level of respect and honor that was denied them in the past, and perhaps to write a different future for to write a different story for the future. We'll see. But that seems to be what's happening right now, and it's a fascinating aspect of this story.
Speaking of the future of the Grand Canyon, not as a national park, but as, a part of the landscape of a world-renowned canyon, can the landscape withstand the pressures being placed on it by visitors to Grand Canyon National Park, by efforts by developers that you chronicle in your book to build a resort attraction at the confluence of the Little Colorado River, of the tribal helicopter flights on the western end? You call it the combat zone, and you write that as we pressed downstream, the sky directly above the river was thronged with helicopters. They flew along both banks, as well as above the main current, and in the densest parts of every sortie, as many as 10 or 12 machines were visible at once, with at least one passing directly overhead every 15 to 20 seconds. Each surge would build for several minutes, then subside into a brief lull, followed by another rush. Can there be a happy medium between tribal activities and national park activities over parts of the canyon, such as the helicopter tours, the overflights? What does that hold for the future of the place, Grand Canyon?
I mean, look, it's a very important question that you're raising, Kurt. The short answer is that I don't have a good answer. I really don't, because the complexity of these issues in many ways mirrors, perhaps even surpasses the complexity of like the geologic complexity of the canyon itself. All these layers of rocks stacked on top of one another and cleaved by fault lines and twisted in ways that make it just very difficult to make sense of it. I think, among many other things that Pete and I learned, we learned that these 11 Native American tribes are not monolithic, right? Each of them has a separate history, a separate set of stories, a separate way in which they see themselves and they see and understand their obligations to the land itself, and a separate way of defining stewardship. And I don't necessarily agree with all of them. One of the ones that I disagree with the most, and I've been rather frank about this in the book, is the Wallapai tribe, which is the tribe that has opened the gates to and made possible the helicopter air tour operation that you just described. Western Grand Canyon, a section of the river in Western Grand Canyon is now known as Helicopter Alley. It is invaded by up to 500 flights coming out of Las Vegas each and every day, flights that go below the rim, fly directly above the surface of the river, that do incredible damage to something that many people kind of poo-poo in a way, which is the soundscape. But Pete and I came away from our journey convinced that one of the greatest and least appreciated and most fragile treasures that the park contains is the silence and stillness that reigns over and defines the rock and the landscape itself. It's a silence and a stillness that stands in stark contrast to the noise that we make everywhere else in the world beyond the rims, which renders it incredibly precious. And yet, it's one of many things that is being impaired by these air tour operations that are made possible by a Native American tribe. But it's important to say, too, that when somebody like me takes objection to decisions that a tribe like the Wallapai have made, objections about the manner in which my vacation inside of a national park is being messed with, what I'm ignoring a whole bunch of things. I'm ignoring the fact that, this tribe was one of the tribes that was exiled from their home. They were not just driven out of the national park. They were driven down to the lower Colorado and told to live in a place called La Paz, which was so inhospitable that the army sergeant that led them there told them that they were being left to bake forever in the desert. This is a tribe that after 2 years there just got up and decided to walk home. This is a tribe that has been treated with tremendous discrimination and contempt for the better part of the last 150 years, and yet has somehow found its way to not only survive, but pursue and embrace a level of prosperity that ensures their economic future. And that pursuit of that prosperity is something that each and every citizen of this country is allowed to pursue without question beyond the borders of a Native American reservation. And in many ways, what the Wallapai tribe has done by building this operation, by profiting from this operation from the canyon, is they beat us at our own game. I mean, they've done exactly what we've done everywhere else. And to now take objection to it embraces a level of hypocrisy that, if nothing else, should at least be acknowledged. So that's the first thought that I have. And the second thought is that, in answer to your question, is there a way to balance these forces? Is there a way for people to see these landscapes and yet not impair them? I think it's possible only if we move into these spaces by embracing a new set of ideas and a new set of behaviors. Ideas and behaviors governed by not the thought of what we can take from them in terms of fun or experience or excitement or adventure or the chance to tick off another thing on our bucket list or the opportunity to celebrate us on our Instagram pages and maybe sell ads or somehow, make money. It's the question of not what we can take from these landscapes, but what we actually need to give back to them. I think only by approaching our parks, our public lands, our national forests, our national monuments, not as consumers, but as stewards, that is a path forward that perhaps opens up the possibility of interacting with these spaces without damaging them in a way that will fundamentally impair them and prevent future generations from having the same opportunities that we've been given. But if we turn these places into amusement parks, we will destroy the very qualities that make them worth celebrating, spending time inside of, and protecting. And I think that's an incredibly difficult balance, almost impossible. And perhaps we lack the character as a people and as a society to find that balance. But I think it is necessary to expose ourselves and expose our children to the wonders that these places contain, because it is only by seeing what they have to offer that we can become advocates. We can fight on their behalf. And there's a paradox there. And I guess I would say that if anyone listening to this interview is thinking of purchasing a copy of my book in the hopes that they're going to find answers to this question, please don't waste your money. Spend your money on a membership to the Grand Canyon Trust, because you won't find those answers. My job as a writer, as I see it, is not to provide answers and tell people what to think and how to behave. It's to lay forth a set of ideas and allow them to draw their own conclusions. That's the best I can do. And in the face of many people's desire for hard answers and a black and white demarcation between good and bad, I fail. I don't have that ability as a writer. All I can do is just set the table.
That's Kevin Fedarko, the best-selling author of The Emerald Mile, and now A Walk in the Park. A great book. I'm really enjoying it, and the different facets you bring to light, not only your own foibles with Pete McBride on your hikes through the canyon, but also the insights into the archaeology and the anthropology and the geology. I have to ask, I mean, the Grand Canyon is a big place. Is there another Grand Canyon book in you, or are you looking farther afield?
Uh, it's funny. I'm getting asked that question a lot these days. You know, I look, I have to tell you, I mean, this is my second book on the Grand Canyon. I'm a very slow writer. Um, it takes about 10 years for me to report and write a book. And this last book was an order of magnitude more difficult than the book that preceded it. There's not a holiday or a kid's birthday in the last 10 years where I have not had to pull myself away from my family and tuck myself into a corner to meet another book related deadline. And I have a set of obligations right now that have nothing to do with chasing another book or another adventure. They have to do with, spending time with the people that I love and paying back some debts that I have incurred in the process of creating this book. I think when many people read books, they may not realize that if they are being moved or transported or inspired in some way, all of that has been purchased by the person who wrote the book in the form of the sacrifices that were made by the people that are close to the writer. Writing is a craft and a profession that is done solo. There's no kind of like communal element to it until you get to the business of editing a book. It's often done in silence, and in order to do it properly, one needs to remove oneself from the people that matter the most. So this is a long-winded way of me saying that I don't know if I have another book in me, and if I do, I will arrive at it only after having spent a really long time with my family.
Well, thanks for that answer, Kevin. I can certainly appreciate it, having been a writer for 40 plus years now, although more of a journalist than a book writer like yourself. Thanks so much for your time today. It's a very, very fun, interesting book to read, and may you have great success with it.
Thanks so much for having me, Kurt. It's been great chatting.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. If you enjoyed reading The Emerald Mile by Kevin Fedarko, I'm sure you'll enjoy his latest work, A Walk in the Park. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.